In 1903, 58 children living in almshouses throughout New Hampshire were admitted to an asylum. They were considered a danger to society and sentenced to a life of isolation and total segregation. This was during a time when certain individuals and entire families were stigmatized as feeble-minded. Over the course of the next 90 years, this institution served to segregate the children and adults who were rejected by family, friends, and the community. Thousands of children and adults were institutionalized in large state-operated institutions throughout the country. In the case of New Hampshire, that institution was the Laconia State School. In March of 2009, cameras were allowed on the grounds of what used to be Laconia State School. We were only allowed onto certain parts of the campus, as some of the land had been transformed into a New Hampshire state prison. We had to have a prison officer escort us through the buildings that once held the former residence. We were only allowed to tour certain buildings because some were still in use for the prison, while the others had been condemned. The buildings we were allowed to enter showed signs of neglect from the years of standing as distant reminders of a life once separated, segregated, and forsaken from the outside world. As we entered Felker Building, we noticed the painted walls of days gone by, but also the dirt and ashes of lives lived and left behind. Memories of the activities here still littered the floor. We were fortunate enough to have been joined by a man that once lived here at Laconia State School. He lived and roamed the halls of Felker Building. His name is Real.
So this was the nursing station right here, right?
This is your office right here. Your office. I'll show you. You set a desk and sit there and watch. Sit right here, I'll show you.
What do the attendants do?
Yeah. Whoa!
Be careful sitting on some of this.
Sit right here. Watch the inmate on both sides of the wall here. That's where you used to watch it. I used to be an office here, people watching. Didn't have this wall around, it used to be all big open.
Big open ward, right?
On both sides.
Yeah.
So on this side, on both sides, it used to be all big open ward.
Where did you sleep?
I slept on that side.
Can you show me?
I'll show you. In the back here. It's up on this side here. The ton of all used to be open. Used to be 1, 2, 3, 4 bed. All the bed all lined up here. Remember?
They curtain on those windows?
They had no curtains at all. Nope.
They slept with the windows wide open like that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What was down that stairs?
That's outside. Oh, there's a second. There's a cell right here. These can go together, see it?
Yeah?
All together. They go together. They didn't have that here, oh dear.
What was over there?
Cellar.
Oh,
Used to be old cellar, yeah. Used to be old cellar there. So it used to be, yeah, old cellar here.
So there was no privacy in there?
Nope. Didn't have that door either.
Same thing with the toilets, no privacy?
Yeah, same thing, yeah. No
No
privacy,
stalls,
yeah.
just
Oh,
open.
yeah. Didn't have this. Didn't have that. This one's all open. This one's all open. It's not open before. Yeah, what is here? I used to play pool. Used to be a pool table down here.
Shuffleboard?
Shuffleboard and all that. There used to be a shuffleboard. That's your back porch going out back to the other building, outside.
So you
But,
kind of hang out here a lot?
Out here, yeah.
Was this a fun place to be?
Yeah, it's all right. You had to go to bed a certain time, you have to fall by the rule.
How many men lived here when you lived here?
Oh, about something, 200, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
On both floors?
Both for Falcon 1, 2.
Okay. And did
Yeah.
you live on Felker 1 or Felker 2?
One.
Felker 1.
Yeah. What's on one?
What was the difference between Felker 1
Same
and
thing to
Felker 2?
me. Same squad, same one. All had to sleep all together.
Yeah?
Yeah.
No privacy?
No privacy. I don't like that, you know?
As we walk through the abandoned and weathered buildings, one couldn't help but wonder how it all came to this.
The school department and the doctors and stated that I was retarded, and I went through a battery of tests in Concord, and none of them were conclusive. They couldn't say, well, this girl's retarded, because I wasn't. So they decided the best place to put me was in Laconia State School.
When I was about 12 years old, my mother went to court. And she said she couldn't keep me in school. So they went to court and they decided for me to go in Laconia State School, which I didn't like.
I was put in Laconia because my mother didn't love me and she said she didn't care. That's all I know.
They broke me and my brother away from each other in Franklin. They put me upstate school. Only when my father found it out, they took him out of Franklin, took him back home.
Took your brother back home,
Yeah,
but you were left to live at Laconia State School.
right.
They were being dropped off. Like a warehouse, really.
And I didn't know why I was being put away. I didn't know why my mother was just taking me and my brothers and sisters were being left home.
The year after I graduated from grammar school, I stayed on with my mother, and then we stayed on with my mother all together. Then we went up to Laconia. Wasn't three of us, was just me and Clarence.
And Bruce stayed?
Bruce didn't come until later. Bruce didn't come until a couple of years later. My mother couldn't take care of us. She said she was getting older and she couldn't do it no more, so.
They didn't stay long, the parents. They just wanted to drop their children off and get right out as fast as they could, you know. That's what it seemed to me like. Okay, I did my job and took them out for the day and brought them back, you know. Which is pretty sad, you know.
And it was my first night there.
And you were 10 years old?
Yeah.
Were you scared?
Oh yeah, because I didn't know what I was getting into. But I found out pretty fast.
I think my mother went a few times, but she never took us. You know, she went a few times to visit, but my father never did. He never went to visit.
We had 14 in the family. My father couldn't take care of all of us. And that's why there was about 5 of us had to be put away, but 3 of us were in Laconia. Then my father had a picture of the state school buildings,
And he said, that's where you're going. And my mother says, no, my dad put me there.
In New Hampshire, the almshouse, better known as the county farm, or the slang poorhouse, was the primary means to provide housing for the poor, the indigent, and the feeble-minded.
Almshouses, which were the last refuge, were places where all kinds of dependent people ended up. Elderly, people with physical disabilities, people with psychiatric disabilities, and finally people with intellectual disabilities.
In New Hampshire, each town and then each county had responsibility for the poor and the indigent, meaning people who couldn't take care of themselves, who were lacking clothing or were lacking a home. There was some sense of social responsibility, community responsibility for helping out those people.
Poverty, or pauperism, was interpreted as a character flaw, not a social injustice. The fault was with the individual or family. Lillian Streeter, chairwoman of the New Hampshire State Board of Charities and Correction, wrote in 1915.
At that time in New Hampshire, all the wreckage of humanity was herded together in the almshouses, with only a very small percentage of the respectable and infirm poor included. There were found the diseased, the insane, the imbecile, the epileptic, and the criminal. No classification was maintained, and often no separation of the sexes, and with them all were living the innocent, helpless children and the adolescent girls and boys, many of whom has been born and has always lived at the almshouse.
That's where a majority of people who were feeble-minded would end up. And in general, the almshouse tried to do two things that were on kind of contradictory purposes. One was to provide a refuge for the poor, the dependent, but the ideology of the late 19th century said you didn't want to make them nice enough to encourage laziness. There's a lot of passing the buck with the almshouse. And the almshouse, though, becomes a place where dependents of all kinds, and now, during the 19th century, the need for some sort of safety net was increasing because you have immigrants coming and you have just more and more people that don't have sort of the older kind of safety nets of community and family. Because people were moving around a lot, either from Europe or from different places in the United States, there weren't the old kinds of community supports to care for people in a personal way. So the almshouse got bigger and bigger, and then taxpayers resented those kinds of costs. And that's another pressure on the conditions in these almshouses.
By the 1890s, with the growing public concern for the conditions found in the almshouses, along with the increased fear of the feeble-minded, state political leaders, civic organizations, and social reformers began to consider building a state-operated residential school for feeble-minded children. The following document was submitted to the New Hampshire House of Representatives on February 14, 1901, by the New Hampshire Federation of Women's Clubs.
As a simple act of justice, is it right for the state, the guardian and protector of all its citizens, its children, to discriminate wholly in favor of those who are well endowed and cast off those who through no fault of theirs are lacking in mental equipment? Furthermore, as an act of self-protection, is it not the part of wisdom to guard society from the crimes, the vice, and the immorality of this degenerate class, who with their weak willpower and deficient judgment are easily influenced by evil? In view of these facts, we, the undersigned, members of the New Hampshire Federations of Women's Clubs, do most earnestly call the attention of the New Hampshire legislature to the great need in our state for a school and home for the feeble-minded.
The legislature passed the law in 1901 to build a school and appoint a board of trustees to oversee the operation of this school. They went to Laconia at the invitation of the mayor and the city council, and the city council turned it around to look at various pieces of property, and they came upon a farm that was up for sale that was owned by the Crockett family.
250 acres of land was purchased from the Crockett family. that consisted of a farmhouse and a barn, along with other various buildings and farmhand cottages. The Crockett House was converted into the superintendent's home and administrative offices. A dormitory, along with a school building, were also constructed. The doors of the New Hampshire School for the Feeble-Minded opened in 1903. The trustees selected Dr. Charles Sherman Little, a nationally prominent physician, as the first superintendent.
Dr. Little then was very much an advocate of the institutions being the place for feeble-minded to live and sometimes the rest of their lives, so they wouldn't infect society.
In an article written by Dr. Little for the New Hampshire Magazine, he states,
"By bringing together these defectives in an institution and keeping them there, the propagation of this kind is reduced to a minimum, and the state is in the long run making a good investment. For every feeble-minded person is directly or indirectly a burden to the Commonwealth."
So there were 60 of these children between the ages of 3 and 21 that came to live at the school. And at that time, they were called inmates. That was the language used at that time.
The original law establishing the school was amended in 1905 regarding eligibility. Children were kept beyond the age of 21, especially women of childbearing age. The population quickly changed from all children to children and adults. By 1910, the school had a new superintendent, Dr. Benjamin Ward Baker.
Dr. Baker was a well-known physician, graduate of Dartmouth Medical School. He was born and raised in New Hampshire. It was seen as doctors would make the best administrators.
With the emphasis on segregation, the goal of the school was to be self-sufficient. Dr. Baker, in his report to the legislature in 1910, recommended that the state purchase as much land as possible around the buildings to prevent trespassing and to enable the school to raise all the food it needed for the inmates, as well as to feed the horses and cows. There were 96 admissions in that year, with the average age of 11 years old. Just 6 years later, there were 293 residents, and overcrowding became a problem.
There was always a waiting list. There was always more people applying for admission than there was beds available. The very reason the institution was there was the very reason why it kept growing and getting bigger and bigger.
In 1924, the name of the New Hampshire School for the Feeble-Minded was changed to Laconia State School. The institution's numbers continued to increase due to the influence of eugenics. Eugenics was embraced by social reformers as a new science to improve the conditions of the human race.
The term eugenics itself is a fairly benign term meaning good birth, but the way it is, the policies behind eugenics become harsher and harsher as time goes on, where biological explanations for all kinds of social problems, it's almost blaming the victim, where it's not the environment, it's the biological background. The family backgrounds of individuals come to explain all kinds of social problems, including feeble-mindedness.
And there was these studies done that put forth the thinking that the feeble-minded were outbreeding us people with the good genes, and if we don't somehow keep them from reproducing, we're going to be overrun by all this inferior race of people.
The idea of the feeble-minded goes from being a burden on society, an economic burden, to a menace. The feeble-minded were seen as a threat to the continual uplift of what we think of now as the gene pool.
It became a black mark on the family if they had a child born with disabilities, because that would then be the germ of a thought that our family in some way is defective, because this germplasm is carried from generation to generation.
Eugenics was seen as a way to solve these social problems, a form of social engineering.
The idea that if we just carefully engineered who got to reproduce, then we would have far superior human beings. And so the people who had disabilities, and other folks as well, who were seen as the degenerate classes, I think they were referred to, it was thought to be beneficial to society that these people not be allowed to reproduce, because then these bad genes would mix in and more bad things would happen and less competent people would emerge.
In 1917, New Hampshire's first sterilization law was enacted, which permitted the sterilization of feeble-minded persons. Dr. Benjamin Baker was a strong advocate of eugenics, especially sterilization. In a paper he delivered to the American Association on Mental Deficiency, he stated,
"The world does not need the moron. It needs no defective or diseased people, but could get on much better without them. I strongly support eugenic sterilization. In time, the number of potential transmitters of mental disease will be lessened."
According to the minutes of the Board of Trustees meetings, candidates for sterilization were reviewed almost monthly.
They have us sign a paper for a sterilized operation. That's the only way we could get out of that school.
Initially, a person could not be sterilized without his or her consent and the consent of the nearest relative or guardian. However, in 1929, the law was amended to place the decision-making authority in the hands of the superintendent, the Board of Trustees, and 2 physicians. The consent of the individual was no longer needed.
You know, you're talking about people, maybe some of these people had limited intelligence. Maybe they didn't really understand what sterilization was, and I'm sure that, you know, they didn't kind of sit down with the person and explain the risks of sterilization, the consequences of sterilization.
At the Laconia Institution, there were 264 sterilizations by 1947.
Often people will ask me, was it just women who were sterilized, or was it men? And it was both men and women, but in going over the records, it was probably maybe 3 women to every man who was sterilized.
They routinely continued with well over 400 sterilizations until 1958, when the practice was discontinued. The vestiges of the eugenic movement remained as children and adults labeled mentally retarded continued to be admitted and segregated at the institution. The years during World War I, the Depression, and World War II were difficult for the institution. Because there were fewer resources at home, more and more families applied for their family members to be admitted to the school. Families had few options when trying to care for their child with disabilities, other than to place that child in private or publicly funded institutions. By 1942, there were 614 people living at Laconia State School.
It was not easy at that time to find the resources that they would need to care for their family member.
Parents were encouraged to admit their child to an institution or special school by other family members, their doctors, clergy, or close friends. People saw it to be in the child and family's best interests.
When we were babies, the doctor would tell my parents to put us both in the state school. Priests and nuns and lawyers and other professionals will tell them they think it's the right place for them to go.
Just the idea of security in a place, 3 square meals a day, and knowing that there's some kind of safety was all that families hoped for.
That was what was recommended, because probably at one point that would have represented a best practice, that your family member would be institutionalized because that's where the resources were, and if people weren't able to care for their family member, then they had a choice of one.
Quite often, parents were told to admit their child to an institution and forget them. Frida Smith, parent and advocate, tells about her daughter Janet's diagnosis.
One day I was bathing her and she stiffened and screeched and was shaking, something fierce. And I rushed her down to the hospital, and the doctor examined her and said, well, we think she's got brain damage. And however the nerves cross at the neckline, she'll have no use to the left side of her body. Because of the severe brain damage, she'll have seizures. She's an epileptic. And the best thing for you to do is to institutionalize her and forget about her. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I just couldn't believe that someone would be that cruel. Talk to a parent that way.
And I think a lot of people in the best of all possible worlds, lots of family members, would have wanted the person to stay at home. But if that wasn't possible, they had to find what was the best alternative available. I don't think any family members did that without a lot of loss and grief and pain.
These institutions were really kind of based on the idea that people needed to be protected from society, but also society needed to be protected from these people called feeble-minded. So they emerged into something that was different than the almshouse. But the roots of the institution really are found in the almshouses.
A lot of abuse. A lot. I mean, can you imagine not being able to do anything? Just sit there all day long and not doing anything?
I used to cry all the time up there. Wish that someday I could get out of there. And then the Beatles song came. That one Beatles song. The long winding road. I used to hear that and I would cry. To find the right road, escape from that place, to go home. Because it was, I don't know, it was hell there, it really was.
And I was abused too. They used to slap me around up there too. A lot of the direct care staff used to hit me in the eye. I'll never forget that. They slapped me and pulled my hand. I've been beaten up by other clients too.
There was people there running around naked, and you had to fear for your life because they didn't know what they were doing. They were very retarded, and it was scary. I mean, I was on a ward with probably 25 women running around naked and jumping into your bed.
People being pushed down by attendants down flights of stairs and wheelchairs that can't walk anyway, don't have no capable of walking, can't talk, can't walk, can't use their hands, but still being pushed down a flight of stairs. Now, can you make any sense out of that? That's craziness.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty bad stuff. They were like verbally abusive to the people, you know, and they talk about them right in front of them, you know, and of course they know what you're talking about.
Just give us a half a haircut, cut his body, leave one side on, shave this side off.
How come?
So if we run away again, we get caught. They know we belong to the state school.
In blood building, you didn't have your privacy. You had to take a shower with about 3 girls in the same room, and then another girl was taking a bath. She was in the bathtub while you were taking a shower, and any attendant was sitting out in front of the doors like you were on display. Your dignity, your rights, everything was just pulled away from you.
One of the staff people was testifying about a child who had been struck, and the gash was near the eye, and she had to take the child down to the doctor. And the doctor was going to begin suturing and didn't give any Novocaine or anything to numb the area. It took 4 people to hold the child down. The child screamed and screamed. And the staff person said, "Well, why aren't you giving her the Novocaine?" He says, "What for? They're not like us. No brain, no pain."
Dramatic changes were about to take place at the Laconia institution with the arrival of Richard Hungerford, the new superintendent, in 1952. For the first time, the superintendent was not a medical doctor, but a teacher. He brought a change in philosophy and began a reform movement. Instead of discouraging parents from visiting the school, Hungerford invited them in. He was one of the first people in the nation to recognize the potential political power of parents as reform agents and help them to organize.
We just all got behind him because he was so interested in helping our children, and up to that time nobody had paid much attention to them.
And he basically said, parents, I can't make the changes that are needed at the school. I can only give you the information that you need to have to open up the doors to you, but you need to be the ones to create change.
Parents of residents at the school, under the tutelage and with the support of Hungerford, organized and created the New Hampshire Council for Retarded Children in September of 1953. He even invited parents to film the institution, and a newly created parent organization, the Great Bay Association, did just that. In 1956, they made and paid for a film, Help Wanted.
Help Wanted has been filmed to help educate all people to the need of institutions for the mentally retarded everywhere, but especially in the state of New Hampshire. The film is in no way meant to criticize those making their life's work the care and security of God's children. How many of New Hampshire's citizens have ever visited its school at Laconia or even realized the reason for its existence?
This documentary film depicted life as it was lived by the residents of the institution and showed to community groups throughout the state.
Try as we travel through these buildings to imagine yourself living under these conditions, and remember that these children have feelings toward their surroundings. They too need and desire good living conditions. There are 60 men and boys on each floor of Felker, and certainly there should be at least one supervisor for each of these large groups. In this size dormitory, it's hard to separate the people by age, and they run anywhere from 16 to 60.
I don't know how many people slept there, but it was so much pay. But there was no privacy, no.
These sleeping conditions in Baker Building are appalling. The boys on this floor eat, sleep, and live in this very small area. This is the only recreation space which these men have down in the corner. There's no other room, no place for them to go. Most of them cannot go outdoors. They spend all of their time inside. How would we feel in their shoes? Is this living or mere existence? These bedrooms in the Blood Building are used by female patients who are able to assist the attendants on night duty. These girls, as well as the girls who assist during the day, receive no wages for doing work which should be done by qualified attendants.
I mean, when I took care of those little kids in Murphy Building, I felt bad for them. I mean, if it wasn't like myself and other people were up there, I don't know what some of those people would have done if we didn't take care of them.
Please note the 4 cracked toilet bowls, which must accommodate approximately 43 men. There's nothing adequate about them. As you can see, each of the bowls is cracked. They have been repaired with cement, and yet they still leak.
Because I can remember someone in Concord making a remark at the time that we were after new bathrooms for the children, and they wanted new toilets, and someone made the remark that they thought it was waste of money because they wouldn't know how to operate the toilets anyhow.
There were no stalls in the bathroom and often not even seats on the toilets. The walls and floors of the buildings were made of brick and tile. Drains were built into the middle of the floor to facilitate cleaning, which consisted of hosing down walls and floors.
Toilet never get washed, bathroom never get washed. Floors sometimes don't get washed.
Take special notice of the facility used for storing the clothes of these children in Felker Building. There is some semblance of order, but it is sadly lacking in convenience. Note the row upon row of boxes stacked so high a ladder is necessary to reach the top. The laundry presents a dismal and dangerous scene. You will note the clothing piled high on the floor, which creates a tremendous problem of correct ownership. Many times a child's initial wearing is the only wearing of his own clothing because his clothes are often diverted to other buildings.
Home clothing was always a bone of contention for everyone involved. It was the parents coming in and saying, where is this person's clothing? The attendant saying, it went to the laundry, I don't know. And then, well, how come this person's clothing is on that person? And it was a case of the clothing being marked, but if there was nothing else in the closet to wear, you had to borrow from somewhere to put something on them.
Outside of a television set, which was donated by a friend, there is nothing provided to occupy the minds and hands of these patients. There is ample evidence of a lack of occupational therapists. In this kitchen in the Quimby building must be prepared the food for the entire school, with the exception of 60 patients in the Spear and Rice cottages. Built in the early 1900s, still using outmoded equipment, it must now serve nearly twice as many patients after nearly half a century of constant use. Large quantities of the food used in the school are grown on the grounds by the patients themselves. Last year, the population at the school increased by 80 patients, yet nothing was done or added to the budget by our state legislature to accommodate them.
The dining room, the main dining room would not give enough food for the patient. I remember Mr. Martin had to call the dining room to ask him to send more food because they were cutting back.
Take particular note of this scene where you see some of the patients loading food into the delivery truck. It is plain to see that this is an unsanitary way to handle food. Many of the containers are covered only by cellophane or wax paper. The food is usually cold by the time it arrives at the various buildings. Can we not unite to secure more trained personnel to help Mr. Hungerford in the dedicated work he is doing under tremendous handicaps? It's hoped that all who witness this film will come to a fuller understanding of the extent of the problem now existing at Laconia, New Hampshire.
Superintendent Hungerford's interest in improvements and his alignment with the parents and the families to try and bring about an improvement was essentially, it's a good strategy for change.
The parents' movement just grew and spread because all the parents at the school were most of the parents at the school were interested, and Mr. Hungerford helped us, and we all had a lot to learn.
When the Portsmouth Herald published pictures of the conditions at Laconia State School, public reaction was of shock and disbelief, and there was a demand to do something. Under Hungerford's direction, physical changes at the school were taking place consistent with his philosophy. 2 cottages were built which were more home-like. There were curtains on the windows, room for private possessions, bedrooms for 2 and 3 people. He instituted co-educational activities for the residents and succeeded in having a geriatrics building built.
Mr. Hungerford, as you do know, I'm assuming you know by now, was not very, very well liked by the politicians in Concord. I'll put it that way. And I think simply because he asked for too much and he was a little ahead of his time.
In the history of the early years of the New Hampshire Council for Retarded Children, 1953 to 1960, Edna St. John wrote,
"When Richard Hungerford came to New Hampshire in 1953, he was hailed with hosannas. Then, as his total professional and moral commitment to the retarded came to be understood, he was looked upon with wariness, and finally, and tragically, with hostility. In the main, New Hampshire's bureaucracy felt no moral commitment whatsoever to the retarded, and from now on it was going to keep a close rein on its financial commitment. The accolades had turned to venomous criticism."
I think they ran him out of the state. I do.
I would agree.
I really think they did.
Was it the fact that he was exposing some pretty awful conditions and arousing
It was that, in addition to the fact that he was after more money for the school, and he had very far-seeing ideas of what he wanted for the school.
The parents circulated petitions in support of Hungerford, one petition alone, in a matter of hours, collecting 1,600 signatures, but to no avail. Hungerford resigned in 1960.
In the 60s, we had Superintendent Arthur Toll, who also kind of continued with this welcoming parents into the institution.
Under Toll's administration, the emphasis on education continued, but the medical mindset was firmly entrenched. Therapies were the prevalent program for residents, and medication was frequently used to control and make people fit into a norm. A work incentive program was instituted that was based on a development theory of learning. A small portion of people worked in sheltered workshops.
But this institution only went so far in creating good conditions for everybody.
The farm program was shut down in 1968, and 2 years later, the dairy herd was sold. With all the progress that was being made with the new programs, therapies, and community placements, the number of residents still continued to grow. In 1962, there were 990 residents. By 1970, there were 1,162 residents, with a waiting list of 400. Although Richard Hungerford's tenure as superintendent was relatively short in the 1950s, the movement he inspired and facilitated, along with later contributions from Superintendent Arthur Toll, planted the seeds for a lawsuit that would occur 20 years later.
They say Laconia was an easy place to get into, only a hard place to get out of.
It's hard to escape from it. And I can't forgive my mother for even put me there. Yeah, it's a problem. Serious problem when I can't even go out on my own. Because I'm living in a nightmare that I'm still in the Laconia State School behind these four walls.
When I first came out, I had such a blank look. I didn't even know how to carry on a conversation with anybody. Sometimes I guess I used to think, well, maybe I am retarded. Maybe I am what all these people say I am.
Going through when people were living there in those conditions and seeing the staff to resident ratio, there were a lot of things that were very disturbing.
People go there during the daytime and they find a place nice and everything. They find the client, the kids and everything all shaped up, and the meals are great and stuff like that. But when the lights go down at nighttime, that's when the screaming starts. That's when you hear the screams. That's when I can't forget. That's what I live with in my mind.
We'd drop Mo off after our day or our week vacation or whatever it was.
Oh, crap.
We'd bring her in. We'd all have a routine, you know, and drop off everything. And then we would get in the car and we could all hear her because you could look up in the building. She was in Floyd at the time. And there was like chicken wire bars in the windows, but you could hear her. The windows would be opened.
You know her scream.
She would be crying, you know, crying for her mother.
There's parts of it you'll never get over. You don't have to be treated like that again. And I hear there's still people that's in institutions. That makes me sick. Because I think it's awful for anybody to be treated like we did or anybody else.
Are you angry at people who did that to you?
Yeah, I am.
I think I'm looking at it as hindsight now that it was really awful, you know. I don't know how else to say it, but I didn't realize it then how I perceive it as it is now.
When I was there, I couldn't see the world, what the world looked like on the outside, because I've been spending more time in the inside.
I just don't want to remember those things. It was tough.
Despite the gains secured by the lobbying efforts of the parent movement, living conditions at the school remained desolate.
I remember while on tour this one time, we're taken downstairs in one of the buildings, and it looked like a dungeon to me. It was so dark down there. And the residents were just milling around, not doing anything. No one was interacting with them.
The Blood Building, the Felker Building, the Kai's Building, the Murphy Building, those buildings were just cavernous, dark, dank hellholes.
At the time, there were generally 40 people on a ward that you were in charge of with one other staff person. When you gave them their food, you would have to be sure they were sitting down and they were tied to the bench. And then after you fed them, you would untie them and let them roam around. So the only way you really knew if a client had been fed, not knowing them well, was if they were tied down, they needed to be fed. If they were up walking around, they had been fed.
Nobody ever denies that there weren't some bad things. Nobody can deny the pictures that we saw in Laconia Citizen and so forth of the terrible toilet facilities and bathing facilities and the openness of the living areas. Those things existed, and but you have to realize at the time we were a state-of-the-art institution. We were among the best in the country. We didn't know any better.
Parents put on more pressure to improve conditions. In 1975, the legislation passed a law, RSA 171-A, which mandated that the Division of Mental Health would establish, maintain, implement, and coordinate a comprehensive service delivery system for developmentally disabled persons.
And RSA 171A reflected these constitutional principles of humane conditions, least restrictive environment, right to adequate treatment, and habilitation.
Jack Melton, a PhD psychologist from the Mental Health Center in Berlin, was appointed the new superintendent in 1975. Dr. Melton brought with him a commitment to reorganization and upgrading the facility.
I think when Dr. Milton came in towards the end of it, we got the training. Because we had heard we were going to have training, we kind of laughed.
Many times people worked on the wards without having gone through training, and we used a buddy system. They were assigned to another staff who'd been there. And that isn't always good, you know.
You learned from the person that was working there. And sometimes you didn't learn the way you should because they had learned the wrong way too.
Everything that we did the best that we could do, but because we had no training, it was obvious later on that we weren't doing it properly.
With the realization of the current resident population of 1,100, with 500 staff spread over 3 shifts, along with the attempt to further improve conditions at Laconia State School, parent groups and civilian advocacy groups resorted to the power of the court to force change.
The State Association for Retarded Citizens, as it was called then, New Hampshire ARC, New Hampshire ARC, approached New Hampshire Legal Assistance to look into the conditions at Laconia State School. They had gone to the Justice Department, had gone to law firms, and no one was willing to undertake that kind of lawsuit. Laconia was just so isolated and segregated, we didn't do the kind of advocacy there that we had done and were doing at New Hampshire Hospital. So we did very little there, if anything. And so when we first went there and saw it, I just couldn't believe the inhumane conditions that people were subjected to. It was worse than the state hospital. It was even worse than the state prison, if you can believe that. The lack of privacy, lack of dignity in the way people were treated. Laconia represented a huge blemish on New Hampshire. I mean, it was New Hampshire was guilty of neglect.
Parents filed a class action lawsuit against the state of New Hampshire on April 12, 1978. The grounds of the lawsuit, Garrity v. Gowan, were that New Hampshire had violated its own law, RSA 171-A, for the provision of minimum amount of services and in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
We argued that by being at Laconia, getting no services, not being exposed to the normal things that most folks who live in the community are exposed to, that the state was actually denying their right to mentate, the right to think, because they weren't given the tools to think and process.
I went to school the first day I got there, and they threw me out because they said, well, you know more than me. They said, you know more than me teaching. Bruce, you was up there. They wanted to teach Bruce. They wanted to teach Bruce something. They said, we can't teach you anything, you're too dumb, you never learn.
We were cheated out of 12 years of education. I went to school and all they would do is give us coloring books and crayons to color and cut out pictures to put in magazines and paper dolls and stuff because they said I would never learn anything because I have a disability.
Part of that lawsuit was to decide what is the least restrictive environment for these people to live in. and how can we best provide services to them and other people who are like them in the state of New Hampshire.
There needs to be a community system. I don't think anybody is going to say that's not needed, and that we're starting from darn near scratch. It's not that there aren't people trying, but we're starting from near scratch, and that's going to take some doing.
The Garrity versus Gallen suit resulted in a court order to reduce the size of the institution and order 235 community placements. The court order stopped short of ordering the institution to close, leaving that a voluntary option.
Even among professional staff, they're hesitant, being really hesitant about schools are not equipped, the average Joe on the street will not treat these people well, we're going to see an increase in crime, and we're going to see, there was all that, so there was always those debates ranging. So it wasn't like, isn't this a wonderful thing? The administration kept saying this because of pressures from, what needed to take place. But we were dealing with really trying to get people to see things differently, and it was really, really, really hard.
Milton also was instrumental in the class action suit. He carefully supported the efforts of the plaintiffs and worked very hard to implement the court-ordered plan.
We were lucky that we had a particular individual, Jack Milton, who was not defensive and was not fighting the questions or the concerns. He was certainly fighting for the well-being of individuals and the responsible treatment of his staff.
The average person outside of Laconia State School doesn't realize the caring that goes on the part of staff who work there. 95% of the staff, 98% of the staff who worked there were wonderful people, and they were pretty much torn apart when they'd go home and read the paper to find out how bad they were all day long.
The majority of the frustration had to do with the way that society viewed the state school. It was a case of, everybody looks at the employees at the state school as being bad people, which, having worked at the state school, I know that the people there were not bad people. It was a case that society had made the state school the way that it was.
You had to treat staff as victims also, because they were merely carrying out what was accepted social policy.
We knew there were problems, and once those problems were acknowledged in public, there also became a common understanding not only of problems but a need for action.
Concurrently with the lawsuit, the state developed a plan called Action for Independence.
Action for Independence called for the development of an area or agency system.
We started forming and making services that would not only take care of the people who were taken out of Laconia State School, but also the people who were already in the community.
People with developmental disabilities, even with severe developmental disabilities, could live in the community given appropriate, as I say, given appropriate supports, and they could flourish much better than they could in an institutional environment.
As the community support system increased its ability to support people, it became feasible from an economic and fiscal point of view to place individuals in the community.
Having a family who was told a message a long time ago, this is the right choice for you to put your child up at Laconia State School, and then for society to say again, oh, no, now we know what's best. We're changing the rules all over again, and they were very skeptical and scared and fearful of their loved ones getting hurt.
It was great having them come back home, but people weren't ready to accept them because people with disabilities were sort of foreign to them. They weren't used to them, the way some of them acted. Of course, they had the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. So we had problems trying to get homes in certain areas.
People around the country, and including New Hampshire, still couldn't see folks living in the community with significant disabilities, even though a lot of people were living in the community. But this myth had been developed about Laconia State School. Those were the people with the most severe disabilities, people who were dangerous, who could never live in a more home-like setting. And of course, none of that made sense in when you sort of begin to know folks at Laconia.
I figure I've been there 28 years. I figured that was long enough to be institutionalized. When I could be out in the community.
In 1986, Rich Crocker became the last superintendent of Laconia State School.
You couldn't do well by the residents who lived there and placing them out, and not do well by the other group of victims who were the employees who were there. And so taking control of that personnel system and doing all of that training all kind of fit together for me.
Rich Crocker did a really brilliant job of kind of managing the personnel functions of Laconia, and paid a lot of attention to career guidance for people. There was an option for people at the institution to actually become home providers.
I thought Arthur Toll was a builder. I thought that Jack Melton increased the professional staffing of the facility immeasurably, and I thought that Richard Crocker introduced an educational system, a continuing educational system, which greatly benefited the clients.
I just believe that if I wanted to hold people accountable for doing their job, then I had to be willing to train them appropriately to do it. And although there was an orientation training program in existence when I got there, which was not bad, we really increased the opportunities and increased the support for all levels of staff to have training.
It was during his administration that the institution was slowly and carefully downsized, to the extent that the governor announced it was not economically viable to keep it open any longer.
The population dramatically changed from 800 to 900 people in the late 70s. By 1990, there were kind of fewer than 100 people living there. So the sheer numbers started to decrease.
The area agency system had a few years under its belt, and they were beginning to kind of develop the programming that they were doing. Vendor systems were beginning to develop, where there were provider agencies providing residential services and day programming. Even by 1988, the beginnings of some of the employment services in the state.
We were doing something that doesn't come along very often. Chances to do the kinds of things that we were doing, to provide services, to redesign our services, to provide them statewide, to say maybe we can do this without the institution, and to provide all of the supports to be able to do that. That was exciting. Those things do not come along very often in a career or in a life.
The culture of the people that I was working with that helped a lot of people move out of Laconia State School were ecstatic about the last day of Laconia State School and that ceremonial locking of the door, never to have it opened again, because we felt like it was a civil rights movement, and a lot of people were free and liberated, hopefully never to go back again.
On January 31st, 1991, the doors of Laconia State School closed for the last time. A new era dawned with the closing of the doors of Laconia State School. For New Hampshire, this marked the end of a dominant service paradigm of institutional care.
This is a very, very important day, a day to commemorate the closing of a book of 90 years of history that Laconia has written, and a day to celebrate what has been the first in the nation closing of institutional systems and opening up of communities.
People who in the past had experienced segregation, isolation from family and friends, and who were considered detriments to society, emerged from the back wards of the institution.
Once the good work started in New Hampshire, once you placed more and more people out, there was more communication. More people were ready. But you're the first, and you should get mighty credit for it, We are the first state who can say we no longer need an institution. We take our hats off to New Hampshire. You're number one.
In less than 1 century, public policy has changed from a model of exclusion to inclusion.
We don't live here anymore, which is good. We are treated respectfully by people out there in the community. I live in Concord, New Hampshire now. I no longer live in Laconia, New Hampshire. And I love living in Concord very much. I work over here at the New Hampshire Bureau of Developmental Services. I type on the computer. That's my create folder packets for people to go to meetings. I work part-time, but when my boss needs me to work more days, I come in and help out.
From sequestering in institutions those labeled as feeble-minded, to regarding those with developmental disabilities as citizens belonging to families and communities.
Go ahead, you like that, you know, Neil. Go ahead. There you go, this is my son. I like to go out, see ball game, watch a bit Strassen, what they're doing, tearing the place down, building it up. Ain't down. Mr. Boss. Yeah, they call me a boss. You can't have this up to state school, you know.
Right.
You don't know have that up there.
No. What kind of hat did you wear up at the state school? You didn't wear it?
Inmate hat. Help the other people too who aren't here, and that's why I want to be on camera. At least I help the other people too.
And help them in what way?
Like we do about the state school, and if it happen again like this up there again, you know. When that happen again, you don't need that no more. Right? I've been up for 20 years, that's enough. I can come and go. Don't have to be locked up behind the key no more.
This change was not easily attained, nor was it a story of smooth or continuous progress. It came about, as many changes do, as a result of the efforts of a relatively small number of vitally interested and committed individuals.
And now the place is closed. I hope all who are here are now participating in it full of life. A life that many others take for granted, but for which many, on the other hand, had to struggle. To those who did contribute, may God bless you unendingly.
There's an extreme intelligence with people with disabilities, and I think if we can get quiet enough and learn from them, I think we can be better people.
I think it sums it up. If I had to do it over again, I would do the same thing I did. I wouldn't change it. Yeah.
Why?
I loved him.
As the rise and fall of Laconia State School fades into the archives, thoughts, and memories of those who experienced it, it is up to us, as people, to never have anyone ever be lost in Laconia or anywhere else in this world, ever again.